and Lisa Middleman. Ms. Corbell apparently didn't respond to their request to come in, their invitation to come in and speak with party officials. And Ms. Middleman, who of course challenged Steve Zappala for district attorney a couple years ago, and really I think one of the early voices for kind of criminal justice reform in Allegheny County. She was described to me by the chair of the Republican Party as a bridge too far. She's on the ballot, to even be on the ballot. Some number of Republicans did have to sign her name to sign her petitions to get her on the ballot, and then obviously had to vote for her. But for him, this was just he just couldn't get behind Lisa Middleman. So the party is endorsing all the other 8 that are on there, in the theory that these folks, a lot of whom are former prosecutors, worked in either in the DA's office or the AG's office, that these are kind of law and order types to a greater extent than several of the Democrats. As you may recall, back in May, ran what they're calling the slate of 8, sort of a progressive criminal justice reform ticket that was about, rethinking bail, rethinking a lot of the use of cash bail, I should say, rethinking a lot of those things that we've kind of taken for granted for a lot of years here in Western Pennsylvania and across the country, and are now being rethought in a lot of places. So that's where it's at. If you hear nothing else I say, if you go in to vote and you don't know what else to do, if you vote for the Democrats, there's a pretty good chance you're getting a slate that's more feels more strongly about that side, that there needs to be a change to the way we do criminal justice. If you were to vote for Republicans, 8 out of 10 of those choices are people that Republican leadership think are more kind of law and order type judges.
Absolutely. You have a follow-up, Miracle?
Yeah, and because, now on in Pennsylvania, we're having to go through and select each individual candidate. Yeah. Have people been talking about doing away with the cross-filing? Because this year it was, not only did it help keep some people on the ballot, but it also created a lot of contested races. So a lot of the races we're going to talk about are really contested because of this cross-filing.
Yeah.
So is there any conversation about doing away with that or trying to gatekeep it more in the future?
I think that it's funny you asked that, because I asked the same question of the chair of the Republican Party earlier today. I just said, is this any way to run a railroad? Is this kind of how you want it? And his opinion, and I can understand why, is, I don't have a problem with it. If you were a Republican in Allegheny County, though, you might look for as many options to keep the ballot open as you possibly could, because it's been tough sledding for them. I don't know that I've heard a lot of discussion about changing the cross-filing. The idea was we elect judges, but we don't want our judges to be partisan, right? Justice should be, nonpartisan. It should be even-handed. The statue of justice has got the blindfold over it, whatever. Same thing with school board candidates as well. We allow those folks to cross-file too. What I have generally heard more of, and what there's been more talk of over the years, is simply doing away with the election of judges entirely. Going to some kind of appointed system. Where, whatever, the governor or somebody, the legislature, whoever it is, local authorities, pick the judges that go on there, because the theory is you'll get better judges. That's a bigger debate. I tend to be one of those people who thinks a lot of decisions about appointments are also political. They're just politics for a smaller group of people. But you could certainly look, and I don't want to name any names, but you could certainly look at the judges who got elected and say, there's somebody who in an appointed system probably wouldn't have gotten into this position of power, and boy, I wish he/she hadn't. So there's always that kind of argument going on there. I actually think for the most part, the candidates who are on the ballot, most of them are pretty solid candidates. Some of them are excellent. Many are highly recommended by the Bar Association. Even the one that got the most negative Bar Association, Jessel Costa, who is a member of the illustrious Costa family, he was ranked unqualified. By a weird coincidence, I've actually seen Jessel Costa in court, and he was quite good. So even he, I think, is not some joker candidate or whatever. So that's the debate. It's been a debate that's been going on in Pennsylvania for a long time. But I would suspect that reform happens more than before they do something to change the partisan nature of the elections, because that makes this perception issue worse, I think. Or at least that's what I think people would kind of assume.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I wanted to mention, it was a story that we put into the chat that you covered, that in the midst of the summer, one of the sitting judges, Guido DeAngelis, retired, which then opened up, a temp seat, and
Yeah.
now there's what would have been 9 after the primary is now 10 seats. Can you talk a little bit about that process and the candidate that ended up in
Yeah.
that spot?
So a lot of people were bummed out about this process, and I can understand why. For one thing, people were talking. I mean, I remember people talking about whether Guido DeAngelis would retire last winter, and had he done so last winter, then that seat would have been up. There would have been 10 on the primary ballot instead of just 9. Instead, he waited until really almost the last possible moment to make the decision that he made, and by that point, you couldn't even do what they've done in other, what they've done in other kind of situations at the party level, which is convene like an entire party committee to kind of vote. They had to use an expedited process, especially on the Republican side. What they essentially did is the Democrats had all of the ward officers. So Kahari knows this by the book by this point. But essentially, the every county is divided up into wards and voting districts, and the parties have committee people who are supposed to represent each of those. All of those districts are organized into wards or into municipalities in smaller areas, and those wards have their own little officers. They have a chair, a vice chair, and a secretary. Those folks, the officers for those wards and municipalities, got to vote on who the next judge would be. There were only 2 candidates for that, and the reason for that, there were a couple of reasons for that. One is that it was very obvious early on that the person who was going to win this process was a guy named Tom Caulfield, who had actually finished 10th in the Democratic primary. And so his argument to committee people was, hey, if this seat had been on the ballot in May, I would have won it. And I talked to a lot of people who thought that that was a convincing argument. That's probably the bigger issue. The other issue is that the party charged a sort of filing fee to seek its endorsement. And it was $8,000. And there were a lot of people who thought that that was too much money. There was only one person who challenged Caulfield, and she obviously didn't win. So there's a lot of complaints. And this has been a long running complaint with the Democratic Party that these fees are too steep. They narrow the field. I tend to think in this case, that while the fees are an argument that the party has been having and should continue to have, probably in this case, it just having talked to people, it really was about Caulfield having having that argument that he was the guy. He'd also been endorsed by the party in May, so you'd be asking committee people to kind of flout the will of the voters in May and the will of the committee itself when they had made its decision about who to back in the spring. The Republican process has gotten less controversy, but if you believe in sort of democracy, of kind of like wide open democracy, it's probably more problematic. Essentially, a handful of the officers in the Republican Party got together one afternoon and they picked a guy named Rick Hosking, who weirdly enough ran only on the Democratic ballot in the spring. He wasn't even filed to run on the Republican ballot. He apparently he got bad advice from somebody. It was what I've been told. But they just kind of picked him because they thought he'd be good. So he finished like way down in the Democratic side, but now he's the Republican guy. So on both sides, in both parties, you had a process that somewhat was somewhat dictated by the fact that there just wasn't a lot of time to find somebody to put on their ballot. But even taking that into account, I think you could make a pretty good argument that is not an ideal set of situation on either side of the partisan divide there.
Absolutely. Miracle?
Yeah, and I know a lot of people, there was issues, still hesitation around Caulfield.
Yeah.
Because the notoriety associated with him is he's the one who told the bailiff to shoot the black man in his courtroom, something like to just like shoot him because he didn't think he was compliant enough in the court, but he's kind of been able to go about unscathed. And I think it was interesting because the Stonewall Democrats, I don't believe they endorsed Caulfield, right? Didn't they go with a different? Sure.
I don't know about. I can't speak to the Stonewall process.
Yeah, I think they went and endorsed another person, so that there's still complexities going on within these endorsement processes. But during the primary, you had the two ballot initiatives that were kind of like spurring on a lot of voter participation. I know there's already been some issues with these mail-in ballots, but what is some of the projections going into this election cycle when it comes to voter participation?
Oh, about turnout. Yeah, I think I saw a range that when the Board of Elections had a meeting just on Friday a couple of days ago, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was like in the 20s. It's really hard to say. This is the first. I mean, I have to tell my boss this all the time. She's like, "What's going to happen? When are we going to know?" And I'm just like, nobody knows, because we're still so into this thing with the mail-in ballots, and the rules have kind of changed, from election to election last year. And this would be our first kind of off-year municipal elections with mail-in ballots. So I don't, I mean, I kind of know some of the stuff that's going to happen, but I don't really know how it's going to affect turnout. The fact of the matter is that although there are very important races on the ballot, the state Supreme Court race being a particularly important one, and I think you'll probably have Katie Meyer and Steve Caruso talking about that next week. These are not like high octane races. People aren't like, as a general rule, lining up to go vote for judicial candidates. And a lot of the sort of municipal races, are also kind of foregone conclusions. So, my experience has generally been that when the county makes an estimate, they shoot high. They often overestimate, and they kind of have a bias to do that because they want to make sure they're not caught up short. So I appreciate that they do that, but my general experience has been that they're often a little bit overly optimistic about what turnout will be.
Interesting. So moving on to the other marquee race in Western Pennsylvania is the Pittsburgh mayor's race, which has been, a much more lively fall campaign than we ever seen, at least since Mark DeSantis ran as a Republican, I believe in 2005. I think that's probably the most kind of robust Republican challenger to a Democratic nominee in my political memory. So what's the latest? I know you've been following this very closely over the past several months. So what's the latest with the Pittsburgh's mayor's race?
I mean, it's certainly, in a lot of ways, it's been lively. It's interesting. I'd kind of forgotten about old Mark DeSantis, the poor guy. But it actually does kind of reflect where the Republican Party has headed. Mark DeSantis was I think what the Republicans thought you would have needed back at that time. He was kind of a successful business person, at least sort of affected a sort of more socially tolerant stance in many ways. But, very sort of much in keeping with the sort of knowledge economy and all that stuff. Somebody that like your .comers would be comfortable with. The Republican candidate this time, who actually had really run as a Democrat, he was on the Democratic ballot, and you're not allowed to cross file. What happened with him is there was a write-in campaign for him on the Republican side. His name is Tony Moreno. He's a retired police officer, and much more in a Trumpian kind of mode. Much more an attempt to sort of connect, with a sort of more blue collar base to a large extent. So, and there's a lot that comes with that. I mean, I can tell you as somebody who covered Tony Moreno's campaign kickoff event, as I left that event, I was like, this is the first time I've ever been at a candidate's kickoff and felt like I needed to call up a libel lawyer before I decided what to report. Some of the stuff he said, it's just some of the accusations he leveled were just, they were frankly, libelous, and we didn't print them and nobody else did either, which was journalistically, I'm going to argue, the right call. But, he is sort of a freewheeling candidate in many ways. But he has clearly had the support of a Republican Party who's looking to, make some inroads into a place like Pittsburgh. Sam DeMarco, the chair of the Republican committee, works pretty hard at that. They've used this sort of tactic of the write-in ballot during the primary a few times now in a few different kinds of races. So it's a thing to kind of watch for. But, I just looked, Moreno filed his campaign, the final campaign finance report before the election of late Friday. He raised about $35,600, which is not a lot. It's nothing compared to what Ed Gainey, the Democrat, raised. But for a Republican, it's not bad. And what was notable to me is he also raised about $17,000 in in-kind contributions from the Republican Committee of Allegheny County. So they basically paid for some lawn signs and mailings and things like that. I'm actually not sure that doesn't violate the city's limit on campaign contributions. You're supposed to be limited to about $5,000, and to the best of my knowledge, that applies to in-kind contributions too. But he is clearly getting some of that support there. So, and I mean, I think people often just vote. People like to have a choice or whatever. I don't know what we'll end up with. Of course, I'll be shocked if anything other than a Ed Gainey win happens based on the demographic makeup of the city and the partisan makeup of the city. But it'll be interesting to see how Moreno polls there. I think he's, I've seen some debates with them when he's on TV or whatever. He's a little more cautious than it's a campaign event. But he is he's trying to run a pretty pugnacious campaign, and he's also doing, from what I can tell, a lot of sort of retail level politicking. So, the guy does not have, I saw him during the Democratic primary, and he sought the Democratic endorsement, and he was doing a lot of the things that you do. I mean, he had his list of people, and he knew if it was good, if people were coming in, and if he knew it wasn't so good, he had done his homework on the race. So he is, in that sense, for a first-time candidate, a little more sophisticated, certainly, than some of the people that the Republicans have run in previous elections of this kind.
Yeah, I think people forget that Moreno was a police officer.
Yeah.
And not because he was a police officer, but because police officers are trained to testify, they're trained to engage, they're trained to read people's faces and respond. And so a lot of times during the debate, Moreno, a lot of people should talk about his sophistication or how well he's able to engage and read the crowd. And people forget he's had 15 years of professional experience and being able to testify or share a communication belief or ideal. And so it's very interesting to watch how people are able to be impacted by these debates and what these issues are, because you're right, he does have this list of people, he does go through him, he has the talking points, and you're just wait, do we have to follow up on that? Do we have to give a disclaimer? Do we have to and it is he knows his stuff, so it's going to be, I think the election is going to be a lot closer than what people assume, right? There's still a strong working class community within Pittsburgh. You still we've seen some of the union splits in different situations. So I don't think it's going to be this Gainey landslide that people are predicting, for those factors, and a lot of stuff is still happening. But have you been able to follow up with the campaigns? I know I always look for your threads after they've been reported. You talked a little bit about Moreno's disclosures. Was there anything that caught you when it came to Gainey's disclosures?
I'm sorry, I missed your question. I didn't quite hear you.
Was there anything that caught your
caught my attention?
Yeah.
No. I mean, I would just say that, I mean, it's kind of what you'd expect, right? I mean, I think that a lot of the Democratic establishment got behind Bill Peduto, which is the typical thing for the establishment to do. It's been a long time since an incumbent mayor lost an election in this town. And what you saw happen after he did was a lot of those interest groups swinging behind Ed Gainey. And so that's been the big kind of picture thing. The flip side of that is, so much during the primary, so much of Mr. Gainey's support came from sort of small dollar donors. And that's dropped off, but I don't read too much into that, because for so many of those folks, the real action was in the Democratic primary. And, that's when they were the most energized. So, I'm not surprised that they, that you haven't seen a bunch of, $10 checks written for Ed Gainey in the general thing. I mean, it's to your point, Miracle. I think, folks who are supportive of Ed Gainey should make sure they vote, on Tuesday, because, sometimes the margin of victory can matter, especially when the expectations are high, right? I mean, I think people probably expect some sort of, 80-20 landslide for Gainey. And I think you're right. I think it's going to be closer than that. Certainly, I wouldn't hazard a guess as to what it will be. But, I think that this is, after all, the first Black mayor that Pittsburgh will ever have, if indeed he is elected next week. So, if you believe in that, don't necessarily take it for granted that margin can matter. And there's also, part of this too, and it's a subject I've talked about in some places, and there's been other reporting on it. There is this sort of thing going forward with how will Ed Gainey get along with a city council, almost all of whose members also backed Bill Peduto. Ed has worked in city government. He worked for a couple of previous administrations, but it's been a long time. And the council there doesn't really know him the way they knew the current mayor, because he had come up from council. So there's some distrust there. It's sort of manifesting itself in a couple of different ways. Some of that is politics between, involving one or two particular council members in particular. But, it's going to be interesting to see how that relationship builds. Pittsburgh typically has a very strong mayor system. Mayors typically are able to get their way. But it hasn't always been true. There were a couple of years during the Ravenstall administration where really it was city council that was sort of driving the policy. So we'll see how that plays out. It's very much up for grabs, and it's not impossible to imagine, city councilors sort of looking at those results and that being one factor in their thinking.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the issue of relations with council. 2 weeks ago, we had our city council candidate forum, and we had incumbent council members, Erica Strausberger and Daniel Lavelle on, and we asked them what was their position, particularly on the there's two pieces of legislation. One more focused on planning and development, and the other one focused on city council's ability to approve appointees below the director level. In your reporting, what have you found, around that issue? Because there was a lot of backlash. I'm sorry, that was a Freudian slip. There was a lot of backlash in the African American community, particularly among the African American board chairs and other folks that are basically inside baseball players that usually don't speak up, around issues like that, particularly around city legislation. So does that jibe with the reporting?
Completely. Yes. And you've seen that some of that momentum for those bills is kind of the brakes have been pumped. Right. And Kari, I think you put your finger on exactly why. It didn't necessarily raise to the level of the public eye. There wasn't necessarily a lot of media reporting about this aspect of it, but you're absolutely right that that there were some people making some calls about that fact. And I do, again, I don't know what happens. It's pretty difficult, and all these bills are, not entirely, not all of these bills are, they deal with different issues. It would be possible to make an argument for why the zoning decision should be different, separate from who all gets, interviewed and who gets called before council as a result of the confirmation process. You could imagine council sticking to one, not the other. I mean, the other side of this too, sort of separate from all of this, is that there's also a long running debate about Bill Peduto and the things that he does in what is essentially a lame duck period for him. When he sort of put up a raft of commission appointments a week or two ago for approval. And, there were some people like, well, why are you doing this now? Why are you filling all these vacancies now? It's an attempt to hamstring the future administration. There's a particular development in Oakland, which, the developer there, Walnut Capital, is a name that's probably familiar to some folks, that Walnut Capital would like to have and would like to move fairly expeditiously on. And, a lot of people are looking at that and saying, why is this mayor in such a hurry to do so much? To do so much in his final days in office here. There was a similar debate all summer long about the use of federal COVID aid, and the mayor and council sort of working to, allocate those funds, if not spend them. And people had the same kind of concern. So a lot going on there. But yeah, I think I think what you have heard is also what I understand to be the case, which is that there was people got really irritated at the message that seemed to be getting sent here.
Miracle?
Yeah, you talked about a little bit about like council. So can we talk about some of these council races? Like, where are the races to look for? Because there are a couple ones that are contested. There's a couple ones that are contested. People have gotten their ballots. We know there are some issues with some people's ballots. The people have gotten their ballots. They're filling them in. They're trying to drop them in as soon as they can. for these city council and county council races, what are some of the ones to look for?
So yeah, the city council race that's really up for grabs is Council District 4. This is the seat currently held by Anthony Coghill. It's a lot of kind of your South Hills communities, Overbrook, Beachview, Brookline, Carrick, places like that. Mr. Coghill was challenged in the Democratic primary by Bethany Cameron, who had been an aide to Natalia Rudiak, who's the counselor prior to him. He now faces a challenge from a Green Party candidate, Connor Mulvaney, many of whose sort of talking points are very similar to hers. This sort of belief that the district needs to do more than what Mr. Coghill talks about, which is the back to basics kind of platform. Mr. Mulvaney talks a lot about sort of the need for affordable housing and to really, develop and protect that asset. There's some more talk about snow removal, which is sort of a big issue, well, really everywhere, but in that district in particular. So you've got that race. At the county council level, there's a couple of contested races, and they're both its Democrat-Republican challenges. One that's notable, I think, is Anita Pritzio, who was one of those first sort of one of the early candidates to run for and win as a Democratic Socialist of America member. Ran as a sort of progressive with a real interest in environmental causes. She won in 2017. She's now being challenged by a Republican named Meredith Dolan, who's been pretty active in like young Republican circles, stuff like that. She works for sort of a conservative online media outfit. And I think the ownership group is called Freedom Fries, which probably gives you a good sense of where they're coming from. That was that back in some of your younger audience may forget that back during the Second Iraq War, people were upset. Some Republicans were upset that the French weren't backing our play there, and so they decided to rename French fries as Freedom Fries, and that noble cause lives on to this day. So you've got that race, which I think is interesting, and because you have you have two pretty strong voices for their respective positions there, a very progressive voice and then a very conservative one. The other race that's also interesting is an open seat to replace Tom Baker, who's a Republican on county council. He's just not running anymore. He's got family and things like that. We've got a Democrat named Jack Bukowski, who's been in the Ross Township Supervisors for a while. And he's running against a guy whose name I am suddenly blanking on and is going to come with me. Hold on a second. Oh, Joe Wise. Thank you. I wrote it down because I knew I'd forget. Republican Joe Wise. In both of these races, you have Republicans kind of saying, this county council is doing stuff that county councils aren't supposed to do. And they're citing things like efforts to rein in the use of less lethal crowd control things by county police forces, really any effort to sort of impose police discipline, efforts to have a mask mandate. There was a very short-lived effort by a couple of council people to pass a mask mandate. And these Republicans are basically saying, look, this is all too divisive. We shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. We shouldn't be talking about critical race theory in council. We're really supposed to be focused on budget and stuff like that. So I'll note too that Jack Bukowski has a longtime association with Bethany Hallam, who's one of the leading voices for a lot of those causes that have been sort of front and center on county council. So you're seeing, I think, at least an attempt by Republicans to kind of push back on some of this stuff. Does it change the overall makeup of council? Not really. It's a very strongly Democratic body. The departure of Anita Pritzio would be a sort of big deal, just in the sense that she has been a voice and a vote for some of those causes, and she'd be replaced by, like I say, a pretty strong-willed Republican. So in that sense, it does. But does it affect Bethany Hallam's ability or Liv Bennett's ability to put bills up and get them discussed? I think the more immediate threat is actually other Democrats on council, because there's not universal support for some of that stuff.
Absolutely. Thank you. And now switching gears to 2022, last week there was two big announcements. One, the first was a longtime member of Congress, Mike Doyle, and announced his retirement, which I think was a surprise in some sense of the finality of it. But folks
Yeah.
obviously were hearing the murmurs, and even just the movements that he was making didn't necessarily send a signal that he was planning another run. And on the following day, State Representative Summer Lee from Braddock, Pennsylvania, who defeated one of the members of the Costa family a couple years ago in a big surprise win, has now jumped in the race, which is now currently have also Jerry Dickinson. So currently there's 2 announced candidates. I anticipate, many more, but what is your reporting been telling you about, this congressional race and the announcement of Summer Lee, who raised a ton of money,
Yes.
just right out of the box, which was a very impressive figure.
Yeah, but also not surprising, just in that she has the ability to electrify a broad swath of people. She's getting retweeted by members of the squad within 24 hours or whatever. So a lot of that, there's going to be a national profile here for this now as a result of that. So yeah, I mean, certainly, but I would say that I agree with you, Kari. And in fact, call me back in a couple days. I may have something on this. It is almost inconceivable to me that there won't be somebody else jumping into this race, and it will likely be somebody who is more moderate than either Ms. Lee or Mr. Dickinson, because there's just simply there's too wide a lane there for it to just remain empty, I think. So, I don't know how many people will get into it. We'll just kind of have to see. It's tough. I mean, a lot of the people, there've been a lot of people whose names get tossed around. And I've reached out to a bunch of them, and they're not interested, for a variety of reasons. People talked about Corey O'Connor and Erica Strasburger, city council people. Ms. Strasburger just flat out said, no way. I mean, just a very, very flat no there. Mr. O'Connor wasn't quite as definitive about it, but he literally, when I called him, he was literally in the hospital with his newborn baby. So I think he's probably got other priorities for a little while. At least I hope he does, or he's in a lot of trouble. So I think that and some other folks too. Some people I've heard sort of the Bill Peduto thing, which I think is not going to happen.
Right.
At all. I think Mr. Peduto is perfectly happy to take a break from all of it, and probably doesn't want to get into another sort of campaign taking on somebody who's to his progressive left. So a lot of those folks, I think, who in maybe other circumstances, you might expect to see talking about it, just aren't going to get in. So we'll see beyond that. The other question too is there is this other congressional seat in Allegheny County, which was the seat held by Connor Lamb. And, we've had a candidate or two say, I'm interested in running for that seat. But the problem is we don't know where the district lines are. And that's sort of the big mystery here. We're about to have like new people with new districts that we don't know what they are. And like everything is up for grabs in 2022, as far as kind of like what this region's congressional delegation looks like. So, I don't know. I mean, people will talk about part of the challenge too is that when Doyle was in the race, when this redistricting process happens, it's political. And one of the factors is kind of like, what do the incumbents kind of have to say? And Mike Doyle was the dean. He was the longest serving member of the congressional delegation. So he had an ability to kind of shape those lines in a different sort of way. I don't know what happens now. I'm not sure. There's a lot of talk about sort of how the city of Pittsburgh would be divided up into the 2 different districts. That wouldn't necessarily have been a bad thing for Mike Doyle, depending on which neighborhoods got moved out. If they were some of the real progressive neighborhoods, your Bloomfields, your Lawrenceville, some places like that, Mike Doyle would not necessarily have been upset to see them moved into another district. But what happens now, like, it's really unclear. And so, there's a question of what seat are you even running for necessarily? And we'll have to see how that plays out. There's a chance that Summer Lee and Jerry Dickinson might not live in the district they're running in, depending on where the lines got drawn.
Which is going to be very interesting because every district is really, really changing. And I know, we're wrapping up, But can you also talk about some of these school board races that are happening? Because I know that is, with everything going on, is also being a very intense effort these past couple of weeks. So what are some of these school board races that people are looking at?
Yeah, so there are two races here where candidates, incumbents on the school board, are being challenged by rivals. Both and in both cases, the rivals are backed by a group called Black Women for Better Education, which formed a year or two back because they were really concerned about the district, the direction of the district. The whole Anthony Hamlet situation was very much on their minds. He, of course, has since left the district, but there still is this feeling on the part of this movement that there needs to be sort of more transparency, more accountability from the district. And of course, we'll be going in, this new school board that forms will be, the first two things they'll be doing is starting the process for finding a permanent replacement for Anthony Hamlet, and then passing a budget. And the district has serious financial issues. I don't know if people are really paying attention to that, but they're real. So we've got two candidates, or two incumbents. Terry Klein is being challenged by Tracy Reed, who's sort of maybe the most visible member of Black Women for Better Education. So she's running and seems to be running a pretty strong campaign. To be honest, she won the Democratic ballot. Ms. Kennedy is still on the ballot because, as with the judges, as we were talking about before, you can cross file. So Ms. Kennedy ran both as a Republican and a Democrat, won as a Republican. But, I think people look at that and they say, I'm voting for the Democrat. So I would say that Tracy Reed, it's really her race to lose. And that would be sort of a big deal, to be honest with you, because the ability, this school district has sort of been run with a really strong consensus from its school board. There hasn't been a lot of there hasn't been a lot of dissension. There haven't been a lot of people who really criticized the superintendent from the school board. So you're getting potentially a couple of people who are willing to do that. The other race, it's School District 9. Similar dynamic. The incumbent ran as a Democrat and a Republican, lost by a very narrow margin, something like 100 votes as the Democrat, but is still on the ballot as a Republican. The person who won the person who won on the Democratic side is Gene Walker. Again, a candidate supported by Black Women for Better Education. So you talk about those two races, and again, does it change the balance of power on the school board? It does not, but it does sort of create a different dynamic where we may see more contentious school board meetings, more things being debated openly as a result of some kind of new blood coming on there.
No, thank you for that rundown. That's very, very informative. Very informative. Yes, and it does appear that at least I know in the Walker Edwards race, Veronica Edwards has been out, recently, running, a robust campaign. I don't know as much for Terry Kennedy.
Yeah.
But
it's pretty low profile from what I understand.
Yeah.
So yeah. And again, I think that everything about sort of Pittsburgh politics says, in a situation like this, maybe an incumbent with a familiar name. And we don't have, one thing we no longer have is the straight party option, right? You don't just hit a button and then you do all your Democratic votes. So it's not quite the thing, but I would have to say, if I were a betting person, I'd bet on Tracy Reed winning that race simply for those reasons.
Absolutely. And so in our last few minutes, is there any other races that we haven't talked about, or any aspects of this upcoming election that we haven't touched on that you think that the viewers should be keyed in on in these last days heading into the election?
I would really pay attention to the statewide judicial races, and we haven't talked about them tonight. And I've been very comfortable with that because I've sort of left that to our state partners like Katie Meyer, who you'll be hearing from next week. It's a situation where I can tell you that the Republican is a guy named Keith Brobson. He has been a Commonwealth judge. Very, I mean, I have to say, I've read some of his opinions. Very sharp guy, really smart, also a conservative Republican, to replace a Republican. But, I think we have seen in recent years how much the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, can matter. So people should bear that in mind. Bear in mind these judicial races all up and down the ballot, even if, and I won't pretend to know everybody's situation out there, what your district judge thing is. But if, like me, you have had family members who have gone through the system, that the decision made even by your magistrate district judge can have an impact on whether your family member, your loved one, is coming home that day or not, whether they're going to jail or not. And that just has downstream effects that can last really for people's entire lives. So all of those races are really important. Just try and get yourself schooled up on that judicial stuff. I know it's hard to vote for that stuff because it's really hard to know what you're getting, and to know how to evaluate candidates. But pay attention to it, because take it from me, you don't know how important it is until it's too late. To start taking it seriously.
And just really quick, and I'll give a chance to Miracle to weigh in as well. Now, there is a recent story about the PA Bar Association criticizing an ad that Brobson did. So what was the background behind that?
Yeah, so I don't believe the ad is running here. I think it's running in some other media markets. I don't think it's running here. The ad, essentially, it's one of those ads where it's like it takes Maria McLaughlin, who's the Democrat running against Judge Brobson, serves on Superior Court, and Superior Court handles a lot of appeals from Common Pleas Criminal Court. And part of this ad said essentially that, I think the allegation was that, like, she voided a judgment against somebody who was this terrible person or whatever. And, the argument was, what she did was she said, this defendant had inadequate defense counsel and we need to do this case over again. Like, that's a decision that, you pay your appellate court judges to make exactly that kind of determination. And naturally, when things are getting appealed from a criminal court, there's usually a fairly serious charge attached to it. So, it's that kind of thing. And I think what the Bar Association was responding to was not just that, the ad played kind of fast and loose with the record, because political ads have been doing that forever, but also that it kind of got to this thing of like, that you're actually sort of punishing the judges or trying to make judges pay a political price for decisions that, that frankly, you sometimes make decisions based on that are advantageous to people who wouldn't be publicly popular. And that's sort of what we expect judges to do. And if we get to that point where we're faulting them for doing that, then the whole system it can destabilize the system. Gets back to what, Miracle, you and I were talking about, was just like, should we be electing folks at all for this position? Because it's so easy to demonize a judge for making a decision like that in a subsequent run for office. So yeah, I mean, that appears to be the controversy. I myself haven't seen the ad, and again, I don't think it's airing here in Pittsburgh. Although if somebody's wrong, they can certainly let me know. I'd be very curious to see.
Yeah, I think that, and it's very also important because also a lot of times people going through the system have constitutional rights, but sometimes the more heinous the charge, the more there is the belief that we should kind of do away with certain people's rights, right? And those are the cases that unfortunately go through the appellate process, because a lot of times the infringement on people's rights are so bad and so obvious. But you do have some of these judges who do not want to seem as they're soft on crime, so then they'll allow at the lower levels, problematic things to occur, and then it does fall on the Superior Court and other people to kind of correct it. So I think it was very advantageous for the Bar Association to come out and put that, remark out, because they do actually kind of try not to get involved in a lot of these races. The Bar Association, it wants to just be the organization that, accepts and reviews and manages the legal field. They really don't want to be involved highly in the political processes outside of like the appointments, because their thing is we have to protect the field, protect the profession, and make sure our best representatives are being put out there. And this kind of like impedes that. So it's very interesting to see them coming from a corrective action, so close to the end. And so some of the things that you talked about was like the mail-in ballots. Can you just, for our viewers, just talk about what that process is like and how Pennsylvania still makes you wait until 8:01 p.m.?
It's actually not as until we know what's in them or whatever. Yeah. It's actually not as bad as it could be. To be honest with you, like election night used to be you'd get no information for hours. Like the polls would close at 8 and I'd go out, have a nice long leisurely dinner, whatever, have a drink, whatever. And then I would start reporting because you wouldn't really start to get like the solid results in for another couple hours. What will happen now, because they do allow the states to begin to kind of canvass the ballots and start counting them up on election day itself, is we'll get a big batch of these things, sort of early returns very quickly after 8:00. And then we'll have to wait for a long time probably after that. But, I think that process, is sometimes difficult, but, I don't actually mind it. And I think we've seen in very recent election cycles, that there's really something to be said for allowing the counting to take time, even if it's longer than we want it to take to get a result that people can trust. Because that trust, I think maybe more than anything else, is what's at stake. Maybe not quite so much this year. It's an off-year election. But next year is going to be a difficult environment. I think for a lot of for those of us who cover this stuff, there is a lot of misinformation swirling around out of there, and it's not just swirling around; it's being actively pushed. So that is, I'm not really looking forward to 2022, to be honest with you, because I just have a feeling it's going to be challenging for really the entire country.
Yeah, well, with that heartwarming thought, thank you so much for joining us once again. Looking forward to in a couple months bringing you back on so that we can, revisit your heartwarming parting shots.
I may be talking to you from a bunker somewhere, but
let's hope not. But again, Chris Potter for WESA-FM. Joining us to discuss the local races and the upcoming election. Thanks so much for your insight and all your wonderful work over at WESA.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again. It's always good to be with you guys.
Awesome. Talk to you soon. Thanks so much. And again, that was Chris Potter from WESA-FM, being a part of our local election special preview. Again, next Monday, we will have our statewide, where we'll talk about the statewide judicial races, Supreme Court, Commonwealth Court, as well as Superior Court, but then also talk about some local races around the state, some county executive races, some Court of Common Pleas races, in the various counties around the state that we really haven't had a chance to focus on. So we're really excited about that. Again, we'll be joined by Katie Meyer from WHYY, Stephen Caruso from the PA Capital Star, and Kadita Kenner from the new PA Project. So, Miracle, any final words before we bid adieu for another week?
Yes, tomorrow at 5 p.m., that is the voter registration vote by mail application deadline. If you're going to be traveling, you may not want to stand in line. You're not sure if you're going to be able to run to your polling precinct on election day. The vote by mail application deadline is going to be tomorrow at 5 p.m. You have to go online to the votes.pa.gov website. In addition, you have to look at your mail-in ballot. There have been some people's ballots who are incorrect. You have to double check it has your name, your address, and your correct precinct, but also you need to make sure that the barcode is not on the secrecy ballot, but the ballot itself, so it can get scanned in. If you have any questions, please reach out to the Board of Elections. I know they said there are around at least 30 ballots that have been impacted. There could be more. So please make sure you go in and check in your mail-in ballot. I know I got my mail-in ballot. Very excited. This is the bubble everything in. Also, this time, if you're voting by mail, please remember you have to dress your ballot, so no naked ballots, and you have to have a stamp. If you're not going to drop your ballot off in person at the elections office, your ballot must be stamped if you're going to put it in the mail. So please remember to get your stamp to drop it in the mail so it can get received and counted, because they did not pay for postage this time around. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Look forward to seeing y'all next week and then having a really cool election night. Either way it goes, we're going to have a historic night. There's so many races, down ballot races where people are going to be making a lot of, making history. And so it's going to be fun. It's going to be this last week to get out the vote. So please make sure if people are registered to vote that you have a voting plan and that you engage in these electoral politics if you so choose. You're muted, Kari.
Thank you for that. I was just adding that for those who have not voted yet, you can go to our website, onehoodpower.org, and I'm dropping the link to our ballot ready online voter guide. You can check that out. You can make a plan to vote. You can see all the candidates that are going to be on the ballot at the place that you vote at. So you'll be able to see from the top of the ticket all the way down to the bottom who's on the ballot, put together a plan to vote, get a reminder email on election day to remind you to go out and vote. So definitely use our One Hood Power online voter guide tool. It's going to be in the comments section momentarily, and definitely get as much information as you can about the candidates. And look, for us over the next few days, we're going to be doing some more activity. And again, we have our statewide judicial, not statewide judicial, but our statewide election preview next Monday that we're very excited about. That'll be on election eve. So we are getting closer and closer. A long election year is quickly coming to an end. And we want to thank everyone who has gone on this journey with us, the folks who watched our 6 weeks of candidate films over the last month and a half. Thank all the candidates who have participated that are running in various races that have taken out time to participate in our fall programming as well. I want to thank them. But with that, America, do you have any other words before we sign off? All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us this Monday evening. Again, join us next. America, one more thing.
I just wanted to say congratulations to the organizers in Philly. We're talking about judges. Russell Maroon Schultz got his compassionate release. He is someone who a lot of people look up to as an organizer and a civil rights icon who's battling a lot of illnesses right now. And he did get his compassionate release that was signed off by a judge today. So again, we're talking about these elections mattering. Please make sure you're registered to vote and you show up next Tuesday.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. See you next Monday for the One Hood Power Hour. For Miracle Jones, this is Kahari Mosley signing off. See you next week. Take care.